Ladies and gentlemen, on today's episode, we bring you some helpful tips for one of winter's deadliest baits, the Alabama rig. So we've compiled a list of helpful tips for beginners and veterans alike to improve your umbrella rig game. We also crack open the mailbag to tackle some topics, including a very inexpensive quantum bait caster, technique-specific rods, and dipping your toes into tournament fishing. All that and more on this episode of Tackle Talk.
Hello, everybody. I'm Bill Dance, and you're listening to Tackle Talk.
Welcome to the Tackle Talk podcast, brought to you by American Legacy Fishing and Outdoors. World-class fishing gear, unmatched personal service. Now, here's your host, Andrew Hayes.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Tackle Talk podcast. As always, we are brought to you by the amazing folks over at American Legacy Fishing and Outdoors. Fresh off of some amazing Black Friday sales that they had going on Dobbins, Berkeley, Beast Coast, Sunline, Bates, Yamamoto, Fenwick, Phoenix, and so many more, to their everyday great prices on all of the gear that you need to keep yourself in the game out there on the water. They carry a ton of brands, your favorite rods and reels from Abu Garcia, Dobbins, Fenwick, Megabass, G. Loomis, Lew's, and so many more. A great selection of baits, again, from Beast Coast, Berkeley, Rapala, you name it. They've got it over on the website. Search around. They have a price match guarantee on the website. If you find a better price somewhere else, American Legacy Fishing will match it. They also have incredible customer service, lightning fast shipping, all from a great Midwestern tackle shop right in Southern Indiana that actually cares about you and wants to take care of you as a customer. You're not a number on a spreadsheet to American Legacy Fishing. They love actually getting to know their customers, make sure they're helping you out, make sure that they're recommending the right gear to you. You get that small town tackle shop feel that's just lost nowadays with most other fishing retailers. So you can go check them out over at www.americanlegacyfishing.com. And as always, you can use code TACKLETALK10 to get 10% off almost everything that's not already on sale on the website. Again, www.americanlegacyfishing.com and use code TACKLETALK10. All right, everybody, we are not going to waste any time here today. We have no news, no tournament results, and in the spirit of Thanksgiving, which, by the way, I hope you all had a great one, we're going to get straight to the meat and potatoes of today's episode, which you know by looking at the title of the episode is about Alabama rigs. Now, I know many of you know, and if you don't, you should, that an Alabama rig is one of the most effective early winter baits on the planet. And as those fish move a little deeper, but still have that desire to chase those balls of bait, an A-rig checks both of those boxes at the same time. So today, I've got a handful of tips to help you become a better Alabama rig angler, whether you're just starting out or whether you've thrown a chandelier rig or two in your day. Hopefully, you'll find some of these tips helpful. So the very first tip we have here today on the program for being a better Alabama rig fisherman is going to be to check your state regulations. This is the first thing that you should do if you're interested in starting to throw an Alabama rig, because every state is different when it comes to how many hooks you're legally allowed to have on your Alabama rig. Even though a traditional Alabama rig has 5 arms on it, you may or may not be allowed to put 5 hooks on it, all the way down to 1 hook, depending on your Alabama rig state regulations based on where you live in the country. So the United States as a whole basically breaks down to 14 states allowing you to have up to 5 hooks on your Alabama rig, 14 states allow you to have up to 3 hooks on your Alabama rig, 8 states only allow you to have 2 hooks on it, 2 states actually limit you at 1 hook total, and then 12 states don't have a limit on your single hooks on your Alabama rig. So it's pretty split down the middle. So really fast, I'm going to go through the list so that you can find your state and exactly how many hooks you're allowed to have on your Alabama rig. If you hear your state called in this list right here, you are allowed to have up to 5 hooks on your Alabama rig. Texas, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma, North Carolina, New York, New Mexico, Mississippi, Michigan, Louisiana, Kentucky, Idaho, Connecticut, Arkansas, and Alabama. those states allow you to have 5 hooks on your Alabama rig. And then the states that limit you to 3 hooks on your Alabama rig are California, Colorado, Delaware, Indiana, Missouri, Ohio, Oregon, Rhode Island, South Dakota, Tennessee, Utah, Washington, Wisconsin, and Wyoming. And then if you go down the list here, there are states that limit you to 2 hooks on your Alabama rig. Those would be Arizona, Hawaii, Kansas, Maryland, Massachusetts, Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont. And then there are 2 states in the United States that limit you to 1 hook, and those would be Maine and Minnesota. So it's important to check your state regulations or check the regulations of the state that you're going to travel to fish. Alabama rigs are one of those really easy things that you can just totally forget about when you actually leave your home state to go fish somewhere else because you're just so used to your home state's regulations, or you're used to just going and seeing guys on YouTube or wherever always throwing 5 hooks on their Alabama rig. You might even not realize that that's illegal in some of the states that you guys are fishing in. Now, the easy fix for this obviously is just to rig up your Alabama rig like normal with all 5 arms and then just cut like 2 of the hooks off if you live in a 3-hook state, or cut 3 of the hooks off if you live in a 2-hook state. You get the idea. You can repeat that based on whatever state you live in. You can also just substitute out those jig head hooks for like teasers or blades or something like that. Totally up to you. But regardless of how you feel about the laws, which for me here in Ohio, I think it's a stupid law. I think we should be allowed to use 5 hooks on our Alabama rigs, but I don't make the rules. If I did, there would be quite a few rules that were different around here. But the overarching theme here is, as always, to remain legal. Fish in accordance with your state's laws and regulations. And with Alabama rigs, that can mean no limit, that can mean a 5-hook limit, that can mean 3 hooks, 2 hooks, or even a 1-hook limit, depending on where you live. Okay, our second tip here for Alabama rigs is going to be, contrary to what some people will tell you, you can buy cheaper Alabama rigs. I would just make sure to replace the stock snaps at the end of each arm with something a little bit beefier. So those cheap snaps have always been the first thing to fail me on dirt cheap Alabama rigs. And trust me, I have thrown plenty of knockoff, really, really cheap Chinese Alabama rigs in my day. I still do it to this day, but the one thing that always fails me is those darn snaps at the end of all 5 arms. So it seems like the wire is usually okay, the connection to the main head is fine, all that stuff up there is up to par to handle fish after fish after fish just as much as any other Alabama rig, but the hardware is where you're going to run into issues. And luckily, on a stock Alabama rig, really the only true hardware there is, other than the wire and the blades and stuff, which seem to be okay, the hardware that really matters are the snaps. So I would replace those with something a little beefier, like a size 1 or a size 2 snap, maybe something like the Owner 12 packs that they sell. I think they're like $2.99 for a 12 pack, which means you can do like 2.5 Alabama rigs for $3. So just over $1 per A rig to upgrade your snaps to something a lot better. That's obviously worth the investment to me. So I think the size 1s are rated like 27 pounds, and then the size 2s go up to 55 pounds for their rating. So switch to one of those and you'll be in business. But you can get cheap Alabama rigs from all of those cheap websites. I get mine from Temu, but you can get them from Walmart's website, AliExpress, all of those kind of discount, sometimes sketchy places. And funny enough, if you actually look at the listing pictures on most of those websites and you find like the cheapest Alabama rig that each of those places sell, they're like the same Alabama rig at every single place, just under different names and sold on different websites. Someone over in China is making like millions of these super cheap Alabama rigs, and they get listed everywhere because the pictures and the stock photos that they use on all these different websites are exactly the same. So you can go on Walmart.com right now and you can Google like Alabama rigs, find the real cheap one they sell on there. They're like $2, and that photo that they use in that picture is the exact same photo that they use on Temu for their $2 Alabama rigs. It's the exact exact same stock photo, same description, everything. They're the exact same A-rigs. They're just listed a whole bunch of different places. But when you want to talk about paying like $2 per Alabama rig instead of $20 or $30 per Alabama rig, that means you can buy like 10 to 15 of these for the price of one quote-unquote nicer Alabama rig from someone else. And for some of the reasons we're going to talk about here in a little bit, you might want to consider the cheaper option, especially if you're a beginner to kind of intermediate angler, or you have a tendency to get snagged. You fish a lot of places with really snaggy structure, current, things like that. You might want to look at going a little cheaper for your Alabama rig, because the other stuff you're going to add to it that doesn't come with the Alabama rig is really where you're going to want to make sure you have quality. The jig heads and the plastics, those don't come with the A-rig usually. Those are things you add yourself, so you can actually cheap out on the Alabama rig itself, because all that is kind of the main connection, these 5 arms that come off of it, some blades usually, and then those snaps. That's it. And I think personally you can go cheap on those. And that is tip number 2 with us. You can buy cheaper Alabama rigs and have just as much success with those as you do with Alabama rigs that cost 10 times the price. Trust me, I have hundreds of fish pictures to prove it. You can go cheap with your A-rigs. Okay, tip number 3 here is going to be a tip that I heard a long time ago, and I really didn't take the advice until a lot more recently, but it works. And that is to use a different colored soft plastic for the middle arm versus the surrounding 4 of your Alabama rig. So the thought process here is pretty simple. It gives that fish a bullseye or a target to aim for that's right there in the middle, and then obviously if they miss a little bit, they still end up getting hooked by one of your outside 4 baits. So if you're throwing like all shad-colored swim baits on all 5 arms, switch the middle one out to a straight pearl or a 2-tone style. Like in dirty water, I will use chartreuse around my outside heads, and then I'll use something really dark in the middle, again, to give them that sort of contrast, or you can use a really bright color in the middle like pink or something like that too. But usually for me, it's subtle, like the first example, like all 4 around the outside are bluegill flash, and then the middle is natural gizzard shad or something like that. It doesn't look out of place, it just gives them a natural middle of that bait to aim for. And I can't tell you how many times I will hook a fish on an A-rig, I will land it, and then I will look to see which of those baits it hit, and it is so often the middle bait. It tends to be a little bit farther back on that Alabama rig, so I'm sure that has something to do with it, but bass are truly remarkable with their accuracy of their strikes, which they have to be, obviously, to be effective hunters under the water, to kind of chase down these super fast, elusive shad and bait fish and stuff, and you see that with their ability to strike that middle arm of the A-rig so often. So a quick and simple tip here that definitely works: change the lure color of the middle bait on your Alabama rig. All right, tip number 4 here is going to be a personal choice for me, but I think it has some merit, and that's to keep all of your jig head weights the exact same on your Alabama rig. Now, you'll have some people that'll say like, nah, make 2 of the surrounding 4 jig heads heavier so that those always end up on the bottom and it keeps your bait from spinning around, or just make 1 of those heads of the surrounding 4 heavier, again, to quote unquote keep it from spinning. But to me, I would much rather have all of those heads the exact same weight so that it truly doesn't matter if the Alabama rig spins or not. The beauty of an evenly weighted Alabama rig, at least I think, is that there is no top or bottom to the Alabama rig. There's no left or right. It's circular, and any one of those baits can be on top or bottom or the sides at any given time, and those arms and those swim baits can kind of play off of each other, and they fall a lot more naturally when you're trying to get down deeper. I just like the aspect of my Alabama rig being evenly weighted all the way around, so I'm not trying to force a top and bottom to this bait. Some might not like that. That's totally okay, but I definitely prefer it. Now, as far as what weight to use, I guess that can kind of land us in tip number 5 here, which is don't be scared to throw heavier jig head weights than what you often hear around you. So it all depends on the situation, how deep you're fishing, the time of year, but right now in the wintertime, I'm fishing deeper water and I'm still dealing with current a lot of times, and even though you'll hear about people throwing 1/16 ounce, 1/8 ounce, I'm usually using at least 3/16 ounce heads on all 5 of the arms of my A-rig. And that seems to kind of be the happy spot for me. Most of the time, I have 5 3/16 ounce heads all the way around the A-rig. Now, that does mean that I have to work to keep it off the bottom in a lot of situations, especially shallower situations. But that weight to me allows me to get to the bottom and keep a steady retrieve without that A-rig wanting to lift up on me. So a lot of times I'm reeling pretty quick with my rod tip up, but even in 5, 6 feet of water, those 3/16 ounce heads seem perfect to me where I can get it down there. I can kind of tick the bottom if I want to at a comfortable speed, again, without that sort of natural rise to that A-rig. All right, everybody, we'll get back to the episode here in just a second, but first we are brought to you in part by Dakota Lithium batteries. You guys know when I'm out on the water, they are the batteries that I trust for everything that I could need juice for while I'm fishing. Whether it's my kayak motor, whether it's a trolling motor, whether it's my electronics, all of those are powered by Dakota Lithium batteries. I have never had a Dakota Lithium battery fail me out on the water, and it is so nice just to have the peace of mind of knowing that's one thing you can buy the best and you never have to worry about. That's because Dakota Lithium batteries are twice the power of traditional batteries at half the weight. They charge up to 5 times faster. They last up to 4 times longer. They have 100% US-based customer support. Heaven forbid you ever need anything. And they come with an 11-year warranty standard. And that is something that you're not going to get with those cheapo batteries that you're going to find on Amazon or the depths of the internet. A company that stands behind their product, US support to help you if you ever have an issue, and an 11-year warranty protecting your investment. That's why I and so many other anglers out there trust Dakota Lithium. And you can save some money too by using code TACKLETALK5 at checkout on DakotaLithium.com. That lets them know that we sent you. That also saves you 5% on your entire battery purchase. Again, code TACKLETALK5, that's Tackle Talk, the number 5, over at www.dakotalithium.com, the official lithium battery of Bassmaster. And then that takes us directly into tip number 6 here, and it is that this time of year, in the winter, for me, it is low and slow. That's where I want that A-rig most of the time. And this is something that I learned by watching fish on the dreaded L word, watching those fish on LiveScope. These fish around me in the wintertime don't seem to want to come up and don't want to commit to something that's so high over their head that they really have to shoot up. I've seen it time and time again on the electronics. Those fish seem to want that A-rig like 1 to 2 feet above their head to actually get them to come out of the rocks and investigate or chase that bait down. They wanted that A-rig to be near the bottom, almost ticking the rocks sometimes and laydowns that are in the deeper water, and then they would cruise up and look at it or actually commit and chase it. And then you obviously would give it like some pops, or you'd vary your speed a little bit, and you'd actually get them to kind of take that final swipe and actually try and eat it. But they were not as eager to come up for that bait than they are most other times of the year. So that's another reason why later in the year, I've got heavier weights on that Alabama rig. I want to keep it low to draw those fish off the bottom. Both regular blind fishing and watching fish on electronics tells me that the water temp, when it's like mid 40s or below, slow it down and keep that Alabama rig down. That's my advice anyway for us kind of fishing around here. Okay, tip number 7 here is going to be another kind of personal preference, I guess, of mine, but it works for me, and that's that I tend to lean toward lighter wire hooks on my A-rig versus bigger, beefier, stout type hooks. Now, you might be thinking, why is that, right? An Alabama rig is a big bait, you got a big rod, thick line, you can really lean into those fish. Why would you want light wire hooks? Well, I'm not talking about like ultra finesse light wire or anything, but the hooks that I use now have like a mustad kind of light wire needle point hook in them versus some of these other jig heads that will have like those 2X, big ultra point, thicker type hooks. And this is probably a bad job by me because I don't have as much information as I'd like to here. But recently I noticed this because in a pinch, I went and bought some owner ball head jigs at Cabela's to throw on an A-rig. And I wish I knew what hook they had in them because I hated it. They were just just too thick, and I missed quite a few fish because I was used to that easier penetration from the normal hooks that I use. And then I had to overcompensate with harder hook sets, which leads to quicker failure to your Alabama rigs. Alabama rigs utilize open hooks, so there's no soft plastic you have to drive that hook through. And even though you're on heavy line and a heavy rod, that's more because of the physical weight of the Alabama rig and casting it versus having to horse those fish in or give it a big giant hook set like frog fishing or something like that. So I want a hook that allows me to just sort of have a light sweeping hook set and lean into that fish versus having to set the hook and pop that hook all the way through to secure it. So the lighter wire hooks and the jig heads that I've used are from a local company here called Jig Masters. We've talked about them before. I use the perfected sled heads on my Alabama rigs. Easy penetration from those hooks, don't require a giant hook set or ruining your Alabama rigs by mangling them with a big hard hook set. You don't have to do that. So to me, a lighter wire hook has a lot of merit on an Alabama rig. And speaking of ruining your Alabama rigs, that leads us to tip number 8 here, which is, unfortunately, you're going to have to replace your Alabama rigs regularly or you're going to risk wire failure. And I had this happen twice this past weekend. Totally my fault because I'd probably caught, like 75 to 100 fish on the single Alabama rig. And there were plenty of those fish that bent that A-rig pretty bad, but I kept bending those arms back. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but eventually those arms act like, when you're like playing with a paper clip and you're just bending it back and forth or you're twisting it and eventually it just snaps. That's what Alabama rigs will do too, eventually. Twice this past weekend, I snapped an arm off on a big fish, and they're truly heartbreaking moments that I don't want any of you to ever have to experience. One of the casts, I kid you not, I had 3 fish hooked on all 3 arms of my Alabama rigs with hooks on them, and when I got it to the kayak, the biggest fish of those 3 just straight broke the arm clean off my Alabama rig. That led me to lose a little bit of tension, and then another fish got off because of that, and I only landed 1 of the 3, which not a great success rate there, still a great catch, but could have been a whole lot better. And that big one still haunts me a little bit because it was a big fish and something that I could have probably fixed. And then about an hour later, I kid you not, I was stubborn. I was throwing the exact same Alabama rig. That should have been a clue. Hey, Andrew, change out the A-rig. It's starting to fail. I was like, nah, just a bad arm or whatever. Okay, keep casting. And then I hooked a smallmouth right off the bottom in like 14 foot of water, 2 cranks, and it was gone. And I was like, well, that was weird. I felt like I got a pretty good hook in it. And then I pull it up and another arm is missing. So I lost 2 of the 5 arms of my Alabama rig in a matter of, 2 hours maybe. All of that because I didn't replace the Alabama rig after weeks and weeks of abuse. And when you have to constantly rebend that Alabama rig over and over and over again after a ton of fish catches, you should start to think about retiring that Alabama rig. And that's why, again, I'm a big fan of cheaper Alabama rigs because to me, it makes that choice a little easier. I had a harder time retiring that last one because to me, that was an expensive Alabama rig. I bought it in a pinch. It was like $15. It was a Yum Flash Mob Junior, I think, and I broke 2 of those 5 arms off on it because I was stubborn and didn't want to change out that Alabama rig. But if that had been one of my $2 cheap Chinese A-rigs, I wouldn't have had that problem because use it for a few weeks, toss it, open up a new one, they're $2. Add another $1 worth of owner snaps to it, and you have a great Alabama rig that you don't feel bad when you know it's the smart thing to do to switch it out for a fresh one because of days or weeks of hard fishing and just mangling that bait with multiple fish catches. So those arms and those snaps will wear out on you. Don't let it cost you fish. Eventually, you do need to replace the Alabama rigs if you've had to rebend them over and over and over again. And then that brings us to our last tip here for Alabama rigs, and it's going to be about line choice. To me, I prefer fluorocarbon, and here's why. With braid, I tend to ruin a lot more Alabama rigs than I do with fluorocarbon. Again, you've got open hooks, you've got relatively light wire hooks, at least for me I do, so you don't need to set the hook that hard, and you don't need to horse that fish in that hard either. If anything, you don't want to reel too hard because you've got a lot that can go wrong on that Alabama rig and a lot of failure points on an A-rig. So fluorocarbon gives me that happy medium. It's tight enough that I get a good, clean sweep into that fish and I can pin it. Not a lot of play, but it's still got a little bit more stretch in it than something like braid, where you get absolutely no stretch and you can apply too much pressure to that Alabama rig during the fight, and then you can mangle those A-rigs more and more. But on the flip side there, seeing the line doesn't matter one bit. If you hear people talking about, line shy fish on Alabama rigs, or you want to make sure that they're not seeing the line, I got news for you. They're seeing all kinds of stuff on an Alabama rig. They're seeing 5 thick metal arms with flashing blades and hardware all over the place. They do not care about the line one bit. It's the properties of the line that matter. And to me, I want that tight connection, but I want it to have a little bit of give to it versus the zero stretch of braid. So those are going to be our really quick tips here for Alabama rig fishing in the wintertime. Those tips were: check your state regulations. Don't be afraid to buy super cheap Alabama rigs. I would just change the snaps out on them if you do. Use a different color soft plastic for the middle arm of your Alabama rig. Use the same weight for jig heads all the way around your A-rig. Don't be scared to use slightly heavier jig heads than normal. This time of the year, to me, it is low and slow in terms of a retrieve for that Alabama rig. Lighter wire hooks can be a great option versus beefier hooks. Change your Alabama rigs out as needed. And for line choice, I prefer fluorocarbon over braid. So I hope that helps some of you out there. Again, this is the time to get out there and experiment with an Alabama rig if you've never thrown one, or if you have thrown one, refine your technique a little bit, make some small changes and adjustments to hopefully catch more fish this winter on an A-rig. All right, and then as is tradition here on Tackle Talk, let's jump into a few mailbag questions powered by Dakota Lithium.
This is the Tackle Talk Podcast Mailbag, powered by Dakota Lithium Batteries. Adventure awaits at dakotalithium.com.
All right, the first question here is from Austin, and he says, no question, just a shout out. When you talk about some of the worst fishing in America, I always think it can't be that bad, until I heard that Ohio rivers are so polluted that they catch on fire and lots of fish in them look like they have diseases. So when you find a good spot, I understand why it's sacred. That's funny. Yeah, not really a question, but yeah, man, I'm not lying when I say that our water is terrible around here. Our fishing is not great, and locally, our area gets, I think, a better reputation than it deserves, just because there's a few people around here that put in so many hours on the water that you're bound to run into a few good ones from time to time. But compared to anywhere else, the success rate is awful. I mean, this year I was lucky enough to travel to 2 different places out of state to fish, and just those weekends alone made me realize how big of a dump the water is around here. But I've always said that kind of gives me a little bit of confidence that whatever we talk about here on the show should work for most of you listening. Because if it works here in some of the worst fishing conditions in the country, I feel like, then hopefully it should work wherever you're listening as well. All right, the next question here is from Terry, and he says, what do you know about the Quantum Throttle Baitcaster? I didn't know it existed until I saw it in a Sportsman's Warehouse Black Friday ad. I own several throttle spinning reels, and I've been extremely happy with them. Oh, that's a good one too. That's one we don't get very often here, Quantum. Because back in the day, Quantum was, Bill Dance and Kevin Van Dam and some really big names use Quantum. And now it just seems to be one of those brands that's kind of been left behind. But with that being said, they still make some fine rods and reels. My buddy has a Quantum Accurist, I think it's called, that he's been using like as far back as I can remember us fishing together. And I still think it's going strong. And it sounds like you've enjoyed your experience with the throttle spinning reels. So I don't see why there would be an issue with the Baitcaster as well. But to be honest, I've never actually used one of these. I've never even picked one up or seen one in person, but I looked up the specs online and it doesn't look bad. It says 6.7 ounces. You got 8 bearings in it. It's a 7:3-to-1 gear ratio, 15 pounds of max drag. It's got a 5-year warranty, which is nice. A graphite frame, but that's to be expected at this price point. And all on sale right now for $29 instead of $80. I mean, you can't find any casting reels under $30 anymore, it seems like, unless you, again, go to like an AliExpress or a Temu or something and get a reel that's going to last you like a week. So that's a crazy low price for what is probably a pretty decent baitcaster. And I think on price alone, I'd probably take the gamble on it. $29 is like dinner for two at McDonald's nowadays. $30 doesn't go near as far as it used to, and to get a legitimate name brand bait caster for $30 seems like a risk that I would probably be willing to make. So that gets my thumbs up on just price alone. All right, the next question here is from Jared, and he said, love the podcast, been learning a lot. I'm trying to get into fishing more and have not done much since I was a kid, and this show really helps keep my interest active. My question is, how do you figure out what rods or actions to use for what techniques, like wacky rigs, Texas rigs, crankbaits, what action on rods and stuff? Thanks in advance, Jared. Hey, Jared, that's not probably the easiest question to answer because it just takes like time and experience to figure out what you like, especially with some techniques where there's really no cut and dry right answer, right? So like frog, for instance, that's easy. 7 foot or longer, heavy, fast casting rod with an 8-to-1 casting reel, maybe 7-to-1, but I prefer faster, and then like 50 to 65 pound braid. Done. That's a pretty popular answer that you're going to get for frog rods. But then there are things that are a little bit more ambiguous, like a popper, for instance, is a good example. You can throw a popper on a spinning rod or a casting rod. You can throw it on braid or mono. The rod can be shorter or longer. It all depends on personal preference. So part of it just takes time on the water to decide what you like. But if you want a good starting point, go back and look for one of our episodes that we did a long time ago on the only 5 rods that you need. That gives you a good starting point about the basics of those setups and what you'll want to cover most normal techniques and what rod to use for each of those techniques. I also think we have a real early YouTube video of like a virtual seminar that I did a couple years ago. If you just search like Tackle Talk 5 Essential Combos on YouTube, I think it should pop up. It's like a actual screen sharing thing with like slides and stuff like that, so you can see the actual specs and the techniques and all that kind of stuff. If you YouTube that, it should pop up. That'd probably be a pretty good place to start. All right, and the last question here is from Kai, who says, hi, first thing I wanted to say was, I forgot your name, in parentheses, I'm very sorry, but I'm a frequent listener, and my question is, how can a 12-year-old like me get into fishing tournaments? I live in Nampa, Idaho, where there aren't a ton of fishing clubs, but I'm moving to Florida soon, where it's bass heaven. Would I have to wait until I get older to fish tournaments, or should I go to Bassmaster and see if they have tournaments for kids my age, or is there a different solution? Thanks for answering my question. Have a good day and tight lines. Well, that's one of the most wholesome things I've ever heard. Kai, my name is Andrew. Nice to meet you. Really appreciate you listening to the show. I wish I had taken fishing this seriously when I was 12. When I was 12, I fished, obviously, but nowhere near as invested enough to look into like fishing clubs or tournaments or anything like that. So the one thing I would say is I would strongly recommend that when you move to Florida, look for a local club or a tournament schedule that would allow you to be part of like a 2-man team to get your feet wet. That's how most of our tournaments are around here. We've got like Tuesday nighters where you can show up, anybody can enter, they're 2-man teams, it's like $40 or $50 a boat, and you have a really fun evening tournament. And that gives you really valuable experience on the tournament side of things. You obviously just have to have a tournament partner and you have to have a boat. So hopefully your tournament partner has a boat. Other than that, you can look for online tournaments, but in my experience, those really aren't the best thing because you're competing against strangers. There's no sense of camaraderie. You know, they could be cheating. They're fishing different water than you are. It's not a true apples to apples tournament experience. So if it were me, I'd go the route of trying to tag along with someone as a tournament partner on a smaller, like local weekday evening tournament to get some experience once you move to Florida. Because I can almost guarantee down there will be something around you. Florida has like 10 billion lakes and bass clubs, and bass fishing is just kind of like a way of life down there. And I definitely think there will be some opportunities around you if you look. All right, everybody, that is today's episode. Thank you guys so much for listening. As always, appreciate each and every one of you. Go find us on the internet, tackletalkpodcast.com. There you can submit your own mailbag question for your chance to be heard on an upcoming episode. Shoot us an email, tackletalkpodcast@gmail.com. Find us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, all at Tackle Talk Podcast. And we'll see you right back here next Tuesday for another brand new episode of Tackle Talk.
Thank you for listening to the Tackle Talk Podcast. Tackle Talk is produced by Andrew Hayes. Copyright 2021. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.